Firstly, huge welcome to all of the members. Thank you for being here. And thank you to Peter Boreham, Tricia Maskell, Mark McGowan from Mercer. I'm delighted to have them with us today. And also Danny Blum from Eversheds Sutherland. And Danny heads the specialist employment incentive teams there, and he's going to be contributing later in the session. Today, as I hope you all know, we're going to be taking a look at current thinking and trends behind bonus and LTIP design. Also, although it's in its infancy as a consideration, we are going to have a nod to malus and clawback, which I think, as we're aware, it's likely to get more attention given the new requirements of the Corporate Governance Code. The programme for today is that we're going to hear from the Mercer team, who are going to have a focus on bonus and LTIP design and trends and thinking in that area. We'll then move to Danny, who's going to give us some of the current thinking and prospective trends on malus and clawback and what we might start to see later this year and next year. Delighted to pass over to Peter and team and give you the mic, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for sharing the screen, Tricia. So I'll rattle through fairly quickly, exec, then I'll hand over to Mark, who will talk about wider workforce, and then Tricia will talk about, well, never mind what you design, do people actually understand how it works? To which all too often the answer is, well, no, sadly. The distinctiveness, really the difference between exec reward and workforce reward is all about making people understand what on earth is going on, and exec reward is making sure that people outside of the company understand what's going on and are willing to vote for it when it's disclosed and voted on. And, you know, one of the great challenges we have, I think, particularly in the UK and the rest of Europe, is the very strong investor scrutiny of pay for performance. And I think the chart on the left, which should say it's bonuses and it doesn't, but that's looking at US versus UK. And you can see that in the COVID year, 2020, which was a bad year for most of us, the dip in the UK was much bigger than the dip in the US, because the level of accountability on UK committees and boards to ensure that pay for performance link is met and that there aren't discretionary adjustments is that much higher. And if we think about that investor scrutiny, it's starting to spread now more, I think, into the non-financial area. So they're asking questions where we've got these non-financial measures in a CEO's or CFO's scorecard. Are these genuinely strategic, or is this just a way of rewarding the day job to create a hedge against financial underperformance? And if they are systematically paying out higher than the financial objectives, what does that say? Does it say that our lead indicators are a bit softer than our lag performance, in which case are we looking at the right thing as a lead indicator? Linked to all that is ESG. So you can see from the stats there, which are from 2022 annual reports. Those will only go up when the 2023 annual reports come out. Majority of FTSE 350 now have ESG in the STI and the LTI. And investors are looking for an evolution of ESG. When we first started doing this, it was new, it was novel, we'd not done it before. I think the view is now, well, okay, we've got a few years to get better at this. Are we really using ESG objectives that are genuinely linked to the strategy of the business, to the stated ESG goals, and to our license to operate context? Are we using targets that are actually objectively verifiable? And going back to the point about non-financial generally, are these stretching, or is this just a way of reducing the volatility of payouts, particularly in the long-term incentive? So they're being a bit more cute about this. And I think some of them have dialed back. They got a little bit overexcited about BlackRock particularly, went hard after ESG in incentives, and then had to send out clarification saying, but by the way, guys, we do still want you to make money. And actually, as an investor in a defined contribution pension scheme, I'm kind of behind that. We could flip to the next slide, Tricia. One of the things that I've been thinking about quite a lot and talking to my UK and European clients about is US versus UK. And one of the things that the US has always done better than the UK and Europe is to just think about how LTI purpose is different at the top of the house to when you get down to 2, 3, 4 levels below. And so if you look at that US prevalence chart there, you can see that the blue restricted shares gets more important as you go down the organization. The green performance shares gets less proportionally important. And in Europe, I think we now recognize this. If you look at the chart below, to what extent is one of the key reasons for LTI delivery of strategy and long-term goals? 70% say yes, CEO and C-suite, and those numbers fall away as you go down the organization. And that has design implications. So if we move to the next slide, I think historically, when we first moved away from options and into performance shares, a lot of companies made the mistake of believing that performance shares were the right structure for everybody, even the people who are 3 levels down. In reality, if you're 3 levels down, being rewarded for relative total shareholder return, EPS growth, is probably not the right thing. The reason for the LTI is different. It's about belonging, it's about engagement, it's about competitiveness. And so a lot of my clients and a lot of companies in Europe generally have now moved towards more use of restricted shares, time vested, below the disclosed population. It's a simpler approach, it's easier to explain, it doesn't create a fake accountability for performance that really people have no control over. What's happened more recently, and I would say this has just been in the last year or two, is saying, well, if we've got restricted shares, why are we cliff vesting them? Why don't we move to a phased ratable vesting, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3? A couple of my clients did that last year. I've got some data here. It's pharma sector, but I've used it because it's the very most recent data I have. The survey hasn't even been published yet. And you can see that we've got slightly more doing ratable vesting for their RSUs than do cliff vesting for their RSUs. And the direction of travel is very much from the left to the right. And the joy of ratable vesting is, although it doesn't cost any more, there's a slight acceleration of the accounting charge, it's massively more appealing, particularly for a new hire. Because the new hire comes in and says, hey, we say to them, look, here's £100,000 worth of stock. When do I get it? Well, after 3 years. Well, sorry. After 3 years, but we don't make an award for 4 months because of when you join. So after 40 months, that's not a particularly compelling offer. We can actually offer them less stock if we're doing it a third after 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. So it's more appeal. So that's the LTI further down. What's going on at the top of the house is very, very topical, and it's very current, and it's even in the newspaper today. It was all over Sky News this morning. They got hold of a copy of the Investment Association's letter to Remuneration Committee chairs. And what's going there is a recognition from the investor community that perhaps they've been a bit too inflexible about what they are allowing companies to do for top disclosed executives in the UK. Particularly in certain sectors where the US is a genuine competitive market. And I've actually observed this. I've got a couple of clients where the investors themselves have said, actually, we'd like to see a more aggressive approach to long-term incentive. We'd like to see a significant opportunity for significant outperformance. One of my colleagues has taken out a plan for a CEO and CFO that has a mix of performance and restricted shares. Even a couple of years ago, the investors were saying, there's no way we're going to let you have both. You need to pick a side. They're now saying, that's okay. They're arguing about quantum, but they're accepting the principle. I've got a client that's about to do something very radical, and I can't talk about it because it's not public domain yet. But again, the investor concerns have mostly berated quantum rather than the fact that this company is doing something really quite unusual. And I think this is a good thing. You know, I think there was diminishing returns on some of those governance reforms. I think you've seen the press coverage. A lot of the IPOs that I and my team have worked on over the last few years, they've listed in North America, even though they're UK or European companies. In fact, I was at an ARM Holdings Remuneration Committee yesterday. I've worked with ARM for over 10 years. It's the first REM committee since the IPO, and they're now listed on NASDAQ rather than the LSE. There were more important reasons why ARM took that decision, but it doesn't help, particularly in sectors like tech, if you're trying to deal with UK-style dilution levels and corporate governance. Anyway, I think I've gone past my 5 minutes, so I'm going to hand over to Mark, who's going to talk about workforce rewards, and I'm sure there'll be some questions which we can get to.
Thanks, Peter. So just going to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're seeing impacting the way in which incentives are designed for individuals below the board level, as Peter mentioned. And Peter obviously mentioned the fact that organizations are doing things differently, thinking differently around incentives at the exec level. And we've certainly seen, in recent times, organizations also kind of stepping back and thinking about the way in which broader workforce incentives support their strategy, achieve their objectives. And on this slide, you can just see some of those kind of like drivers that we're seeing in terms of design, decision points. I think, the important element here is that, organizations are continuing to change. There's a focus on driving sustainability and growth, and ensuring that basically the incentive structures that are in place are strategically aligned in that context is really important. You see at the bottom here that what we've seen from our research is that basically organizations that are driving growth effectively are tending to also design in the context of different groups and how those groups are also contributing. So certainly from the reviews that we've done over the last 2 years, we're seeing kind of organizations start to recognize the fact that a greater degree of segmentation oftentimes is important in terms of making sure that the designs are effective to reflect distinctions in different parts of the business strategy. I think the second point here is, just thinking about kind of the role that variable pay plays in engaging employees and, the shift in, employee attitudes and the drivers of motivation. And this, basically also relates to the way in which the world of work is changing and how individuals collaborate to perform as well. And that's certainly kind of influencing the way that we're seeing companies think about the right level to set performance objectives for, and also the way in which incentives should reflect individual contribution. The extent to which, for example, you use a multiplicative or an additive scheme, the way in which you actually drive kind of more management focus on the things that matter in terms of reinforcing kind of differences in performance. So that's become kind of quite an important driver as well. And I think the last point here is really just about how you define performance as well. So, organizations are, thinking more broadly around, what performance looks like. Clearly, what we've seen from an exec level is increased focus on ESG metrics, for example. And certainly, as we've looked at what organizations are doing further down the organization, we're also seeing indications that basically the purpose and values of the organizations are also starting to get reflected a bit more strongly in design of incentive structures as well. I think one thing we do get asked quite a lot by organizations is, basically, is the emphasis of variable pay changing? Are organizations thinking about doing things differently, or, dialing up or dialing down use of variable pay? Ultimately, cost management is still kind of important consideration for organizations, having kind of that flexibility in the cost base that variable pay provides. Variable pay is still very important in signposting what's important to the organization and what's valued, so plays an important role in terms of indicating kind of performance requirements. And I think the third point, is that you can't get away from, to an extent, is, maintaining competitiveness and having something which looks compelling, for individuals with the organization and also kind of individuals that you're looking to hire as well. So, most of the work that we've done, we've seen organizations ask that question, but actually maintain, broadly speaking, kind of a focus on variable pay at kind of, what we would have seen, I guess, as, fairly kind of like typical levels kind of over time as well. We'll touch on it a little bit as we go through, but I think also kind of things like recognition as a program and, an important aspect of, reinforcing what's important has become more, prevalent in the suite of variable pay tools that organizations are using as well. So, Patricia, we'll just move to the next slide. Just wanted to share kind of some statistics around kind of the level at which organizations are setting their programs, and also kind of touch on that link to individual performance as well. You can see on the left-hand side, there's very strong use of both corporate and business unit levels of performance within design. We've seen some organizations more strongly emphasize team performance in their design considerations, but as you can see here, kind of it still remains almost kind of like a subset of the design structure, given the focus typically is on simplicity. What we're seeing organizations do is try and actually create kind of like more line of sight through performance management and goal cascade to how individuals can influence, for example, the business unit, rather than necessarily kind of like setting objectives at a more micro level within, the structure of an overall plan. I think, ultimately, we've seen kind of companies go both ways on this. I think, for organizations where actually there's basically a strong culture, clear performance focus. What I've observed is more emphasis on that segmentation and a drive more strongly down to the business unit level in terms of the way in which organizations are setting their designs. But that said, we have seen some organizations elevate the level of performance defined and measured back to the group across the organization, and generally what that has been done in the context of is where companies are trying to reinforce and reset culture and also create kind of like a consistent messaging across the organization about what's important. So certainly I think different contexts are driving for different solutions. But certainly, in general kind of business as usual, I think what we're seeing is kind of more emphasis on that kind of localization of impact and recognizing differences in kind of different parts of the organization in terms of how performance is being defined. I think the more kind of material change is probably on the right-hand side in terms of the link to individual performance. As I mentioned before, when you look at the market, you tend to see pretty even distribution of organizations using additive designs versus multiplicative designs. I think the trend that we're seeing is that more organizations are focusing on basically, managing performance differentiation where that makes a material difference to the individual, and also really kind of like helps the organization basically drive retention and engagement of individuals. So typically what we've seen is more plans becoming multiplicative, more focus of management time on actually managing those outliers, so the 20% of individuals that are kind of tracking above or below in terms of the core performance within the organization, and driving kind of far stronger differentiation within that type of design structure for those individuals that are kind of exceeding within the organization as well. Okay. Clearly from a management time perspective, that means that the emphasis is more around actually material differences, and that's becoming quite important. Trisha, just go to the next slide. We'll share this obviously in the slides, but just a little bit of a kind of map of evolution, if you like, in terms of some of the journeys that organizations have gone on. As I mentioned, driving a broader kind of definition of performance. So, things like the implementation of an element of ESG linked metrics below the executive is becoming kind of like something which, again, as you signpost what's important, more organizations are implementing within their plans. The way in which work is done and that mix of individual and shared is becoming kind of like really balanced in many organizations. And, I think also what we've seen is, basically that kind of broader differentiation between individuals within the structure of the plan design as well. I think on the right-hand side, just call a couple of things out. We're seeing kind of companies trying to do more with the same or more with less. So a shift from budgeted to pooled approaches is actually something we've seen quite a lot in the last 12 months, which is interesting. And also alongside that, thinking about kind of eligibility, who is really impacting performance. Should we be focusing basically incentives more strongly on those that can directly contribute to results? And that comes back to that broader point about recognition. You know, should we be using recognition programs more kind of effectively within our organization, not only to drive values, but also create more immediacy of reward for all positions within the organization that perhaps can't influence, you know, the financial outcomes of the organization so strongly. Last point I'll just make on this is just around choice and the fact that, you know, we're still seeing some organizations experiment with choice within kind of variable pay plans. I think it's not something which has become hugely mainstream at this point in time. But again, I think as part of a broader, you know, strong value proposition, it's you know, an important consideration. How do you make sure it's relevant? And I think what I've seen is more organizations take that through the segmentation route rather than necessarily the individual kind of like choice route, for the reasons of controlling the messaging around what's important to the organization and the balance, etc. But it's certainly an important consideration. Last thing I'll just kind of briefly touch on before handing over to Tricia is just the next slide around kind of thinking about kind of segmentation and, you know, basically the construct of the workforce differently. You know, this is a very interesting kind of like approach where the approach to design segments of the workforce is more driven by the ability of those segments or role types to influence performance outcomes, and, you know, ultimately reflecting the importance of capability and proficiency in role, so skills-based approaches to compensation versus more performance-oriented approaches to compensation. So this doesn't necessarily kind of mean that segmentation is, you know, basically delineated by job family lines. It can actually be quite specific to the role. And so we're seeing more organizations start to look at positions' ability to impact performance and then start to think about the balance of pay in terms of skills versus variable on that basis, rather than necessarily saying, well, we've got commercial roles and non-commercial roles, we've got group roles, and we've got basically business unit roles, and we'll kind of structure our approach on that basis. So again, kind of, you know, starting to influence the way that organizations are thinking about the segments that they design for, which is kind of something that is starting to become more sophisticated as more skills-based organizations start to emerge. So Tricia.
So why should you be communicating all of the things that Mark and Peter were talking about? So we've found, and through our research, we've really identified that there is a correlation and a really positive impact on employees in terms of their satisfaction with their reward, their understanding with their reward, their satisfaction with their reward, and their commitment to the organization when communication is good. So it does really mean that putting time and effort into the development and design of the reward and incentive is important, but obviously also being able to communicate it in a way that people will understand it is also important. So these statistics that we've got, they're a refresh of data research that we conduct on a regular basis. They were out last summer. Shows that where you have good communications and where employees have rated the communications good, that they have a much higher level of satisfaction with their rewards. Then also similarly where you've got communication rated as good, their commitment to the organization is also really important and really high. And so I think the thing about communicating well means that, yes, you have the understanding and create a greater understanding of what the organization is doing, the direction, but also the contribution of the individuals as well. And Mark pulled out a number of different points in terms of segmentation, making sure that people understand, reinforcing purpose, value, resetting culture. All of these things can be incorporated into the communications to really help people understand that direction. Good communication also helps support positive organizational culture, the sense of belonging, again, that Mark talked about. And it really helps pull out how employees can themselves be contributing to the success of the organization, the success of their team, the line of business. And finally, it's a really positive way of creating trust and credibility for the organization itself. So when you look at, we've talked here today about the different audiences. Peter was talking about the executives and the more senior level audiences within the organization. Mark was talking about the wider general workforce. Now, all of them are going to have different requirements in terms of, or levels of understandings of these incentives. So here on this table, we just put out sort of little categories, things like familiarity with compensation programs, financial literacy, strategic alignment, and the communication channels, and looked at how they apply to executives. So you can assume with executives that they're going to be much more familiar with compensation programs, including LTIPs and what they are and why they're there, but the general workforce may not. And so you need to really think about how you would create communications around that. Same with the financial literacy. So you might need to spend more time with the general workforce explaining, being very simple with the language, giving scenarios, giving examples. For both, it's really important in terms of creating that strategic alignment to the organization. But again, the general workforce won't understand and know and be party to the conversations that obviously executives are. And so really being able to point this out is very important. And then finally, if we think about the communications channels, it's really important to consider what will work for the different audiences. And just generally in communications, sort of a one-to-one or a person-to-person communication is always the best way of communicating anything, any change, particularly because you have that opportunity to explain, to look at people's faces, see whether they are getting it or not getting it, answer questions. But you also need to be able to reinforce through different types of channels. So you can't rely on one communication method. So, however, with executives, more direct access to the leadership means that you can have, a written piece plus that conversation. Broader audiences will also need a backup. You'll need emails, potentially, they're explaining. You'll need nudges, maybe if there is an action for people to be able to take to go onto the platform. You might want to explain it broadly at a town hall and then cascade down through people meetings or team meetings, and then one-to-one meetings with people managers. So it's really thinking holistically about what's the best way to be able to communicate all the important messages. And again, as Mark was talking about, reinforcing the culture, reinforcing the objectives of what the incentive is all about and how they can contribute. So here we have various examples for an executive audience, and we've printed guides. Some organizations still like the idea of printed. It's something people can hold on to, and it's something that is very tangible, physical. More latterly, people are using digital guides, but we keep the information very simple, very easy to dive into. We give scenarios, we give the financial elements that are really important to people. So you have the guides, the participant guides, you have grant flyers, personalizing them where you can, talking about providing ongoing updates on the, if an LTIP is announced and it's a 3-year, you want to make sure people are engaging with it on an ongoing basis. So annual review statements could be quarterly if you're announcing your results quarterly. And then also things like presentations where you're giving you're talking through what the LTIP is, or the incentive is, what the design was, why it's come to this, and really giving those participants at an executive level the opportunity to ask questions and really understand it and buy in. And then finally also online modelers, where they're able to then look at sort of use data themselves to be able to identify how things will change in terms of what they will receive depending on the different criteria that they look at and can change in the modeler. But we can assume a level of understanding there. For workforce, again, we need to assume that there really needs to be a lot more engagement now and information that's required for them. The subjects and the different methods and tactics aren't necessarily different, but I think the level of detail that you go into and how you're explaining and where you're able to demonstrate the information for them is very different. So really looking at a bit more of a deep dive into the information and how it applies to them. definitely personalizing the grant flyers and personalizing letters so that people really can understand it, so that they really get to see what it means to them physically, you know, tangibly, in terms of the numbers at the end of the day. This is an example of a client that we worked with. And the reason I've chosen this is because they've actually done end to end in terms of their audio and the LTIP incentive that they were launching. Firstly, they started with their management. They then moved on to the high potential and critical skills. Again, Mark was talking about who impacts the most, and then looking at the customer delight team. So it was 3 phases of the rollout. And if you're using data, you really need to think about the time frame for this, because it is important to get that right and make sure that we're able to you're able to pull the right information in and then disseminate it in an organized way. We created a plan that covered a number of different tactics. So it was a launch email that had a video, and also linked to a video of the CEO who was welcoming everyone. It was a really lovely personal touch. This actually happened at the beginning of COVID, but the CEO, we still managed to find a way for the CEO to self-record the video and give it. And it was just a really good, personal, warm way of inviting people to the new incentive. Participants' guides tailored to the different audiences, personalized letters and grant flyers, nudge emails were also sent to make sure that people were taking the action that they needed to. And also they had a mobile-friendly website, which meant that they could participants could also see it on their mobile phones in a very easy to view format. We also created stakeholder guides to explain the situation, what was happening, and also manager talking points, which were again tailored for each of the different audience groups as the cascade was happening. Our objective was really to make it simple, really make sure that the content was so easy for people to understand, to make it accessible, so hence the mobile-friendly site, and also being able to have conversations, and then also personalized so that people really understood what it meant to them and what their contribution was all about. You can see that this is probably a bit small, but this is sort of an example of the timeframes that we sent everything out. We had sent out this compensation statement, participant flyer and the participant guides at one time, with accompanying talking points to the managers so that they knew what they were talking about. At the same time, we launched the website with some FAQs. Then there were emails, there was introduction to it was E-Trade, this was the platform, but whatever the platform is, and then just ongoing reminders. So it's not a once and done thing. Communication is never once and done. You need to reinforce it on an ongoing basis, particularly if you're trying to reinforce objectives, goals, purpose, values, action that people need to take. And then this was replicated for the different phases and the different audiences. And then just to give you a sense of what goes into a guide, I won't take, this is my last slide, but I won't take up much more time. It's really trying to, we were tailoring the content. It's generally pretty similar, but it's some of the language and some of the messaging that you want to include that is different for the different audiences. But welcoming the participants to the incentive. Why are you doing this? How this is everybody coming together and really driving the business forward. Explaining what the incentive actually is, particularly for those who aren't sure, but even for leaders, they may not be familiar. Explaining what the offering actually is in clear and simple ways, talking through what the potential of the incentive is, and giving some data and stats in terms of what that might look like. But then it's also really important to talk things about like tax implications, or on this management level, it was all about insider trading policies and making sure that people just really understood what the governance was as well, and what their expectations around their behaviors were. Then also information like, well, what happens if I leave? What happens if, you know, I change job? All those little bits that people will get confused about if they're not aware of what might happen and how to use the platform as well. And then very important, always have a way of being able to go back to the team to ask questions, to have an opportunity to go have a dialogue and really clarify if there are any questions or issues that they experience. So in terms of rounding up, I just wanted to finish on this slide, and then I'll stop sharing. But I think communication is so important. You can have the best design in the world, but unless you're able to communicate it well, people will not know why you're doing it, not know why they should be paying attention to this, how they can benefit from it, but also how they can make the business go forward. So 5 times more satisfied with their pay, 2 to 3 times more satisfied with their job, and then 2 to 3 times more committed to the organization. I think just with some thought and consideration being put into the communications, you're going to really reap benefits.
Super, thank you. Thank you very much to the 3 of you. I'm keen that we give Danny a chance to share his malus and clawback insight. So Danny, over to you.
Hi everyone. I'm going to keep this quite brief. We could easily speak for an hour on this subject, at least. And just looking at the 4 key points I mentioned on the slide, and I think a bit of history. Karen, when you started, you said you described this as a kind of a newish issue. It's certainly become a lot more topical. I think most of that's media-led, and some high-profile cases where the concepts of malus and clawback have become a real focus in the case of some companies because there's been mistakes in the financial statements, in other companies because there's been examples of, quite frankly, bad behavior of different natures, and rightly so, that if someone has been unduly enriched at the expense of shareholders or has done something which they really shouldn't have done, whether it relates directly to them and their activity or their responsibilities, then it is very understandable that there should be some kind of consequence. People talk about malus and clawback being quite recent. I remember looking at this. Obviously, it started in the financial sector primarily way more than 15 years ago. But even 15 years ago, we were talking about putting these provisions in, certainly for main market companies. And right from the beginning, it was, as the name suggests, it was about limiting risk and allowing companies to make appropriate adjustments and make sure that shareholders were not prejudiced by the activity of the management team primarily. Again, picking up on some of the themes that we've just heard, that there's, I think, an important question as to how far down an organization these kind of concepts should be applied. Historically, I think they were just applied across the board. They were just a feature when they were, or as they were introduced, they were a feature of arrangements generally. They're becoming more common in AIM companies, and there's been a couple of high-profile cases in the courts which have kind of set the parameters around how this should be done from a legal perspective. The most famous case probably is the Lloyds Banking Group recovery from this former CEO. But it's, in the press now with Endeavour Mining and many other cases are live issues. It's also become much more of an international topic, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But clearly, from a regulatory perspective, we've got the new SEC rules, which were enforceable from the beginning of this year, and the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, has kind of adopted approaches. Those are very much geared around financial misstatements, and the US is somewhat behind, should we say, in terms of the application of these kind of provisions. Although I was reading a plan this morning from a US client, which is very well known, and probably everyone on this group would have touched one of their products in the last week. They have a recoupment policy, as they call it, which is linked to misconduct, but where that misconduct led to a mistake in the financial statements. It's not really focusing on the activity of the individuals concerned, which I think is going to be an evolving area. So we'll come back to international in a moment, but just looking at where we are now, we see an awful lot as lawyers and specialists on the incentive side. We obviously help our financial services regulated businesses with a slightly enhanced required approach imposed by regulation. As I said, listed companies, it's become the norm, and everything is kind of feeding each other. We also see a lot of different ways of doing this through the work we do on takeovers, and certainly in the listed space. And there's still a debate as to whether it should be both malus or cause, as it's often called in the US, and clawback, or one or the other, or both. Most companies we're seeing are imposing both. And then you're really getting into the questions around the design and the detail. And that detail drives some of the legal issues, which are no doubt going to become a big issue over the next 5 years, just looking forward as well. So the concepts and the topics which are addressed by the malus and clawback provisions, there's broadly two schools of thought in terms of drafting these provisions. Do you do something very general, lots of discretion, or do you try and actually be a bit more prescriptive but have an element of discretion as well in the drafting? And it's a balance. It's all about enforceability. The focus of the regulator and the governance is putting something in place that actually works, not paying lip service to it. Which is why over the last few years we've also seen an extension of the periods for which clawback, when money's been or value's been received, applying. We've seen the suggestion, very strong suggestion, that nominee structures be put in place to facilitate those actual reinforcement and recoupment of value. Not an easy thing. Questions around, should it be the gross, should it be the net? Looking at the cost to the company, and all of that goes into some of the legal analysis and questions around causation. Does the activity of an individual who you're trying to apply malus or clawback, must they directly have caused the problem? What about if they're a line manager? What are their responsibilities? How directly can you link the action and the consequence to how you then apply the provisions? Clearly, you've got an evolving area of regulation, depending on the size of a regulated business, how much a regulator would want to enforce it. A lot of these issues are being grappled with behind the scenes, and there's an awful lot of adjustments, shall we say, to bonuses, to salary, even what we call cross clawback, so adjusting provisions or adjusting payments and reducing payments, but recouping that money from other sources as well, from termination payments. And all of that raises some really difficult questions around enforceability. The questions around corporate governance and the future, we obviously have the very live, most recent publication of the Corporate Governance Code just this week. We've got some statements. I didn't hear them directly, so it may be misattributed, but apparently Julia Hoggett, CEO at Stock Exchange, said whilst it used to be comply and or explain, it's now comply or else. And you've got the hype created just overnight. Peter, I was actually reading it last night on Sky News. I know most people read it this morning, but it's the confluence of clawback, size of pay, malus provision, all of that coming at once, which is very much driving, I think, a change of sense of how these things should be put together. Fundamentally, as I started, the idea that someone should not be unjustly enriched must be right, but it's about a balance and making sure that when you're looking at communication, as was discussed also, you're not sending something out to employees with a provision which says we can take it all away from you. Or not only that, even if you receive it, we can ask you to pay back. It's how you communicate those messages and explain it's very much for bad behavior or a genuine mistake. Now, some of that's not necessarily in the individual's control, but it's just about thinking about how the messaging lands and make sure it works properly. And the focus of the governance is about disclosure. So I think going forwards, we're going to see, because there's now going to be an obligation to disclose the provisions, there's going to be an obligation to disclose how those provisions were used. And I think just like pay has changed because of the level of disclosure, this is an area where the way people do things, at least on the larger companies and this audience, are doing things and how provisions are drafted, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny because people will be aware in more detail as to what others are doing. And it's not just about who your current advisor is and what they're doing. It's also taking account of what other people are doing. There's also a risk, as there has been, I think, a trend with the writing of policies in remuneration reports. So everyone just copying each other and just doing what everyone else is doing. I think that will happen because that's the way these things always happen. But certainly the focus, and there will be some cases, no doubt, where in certain businesses, if they're not really thinking about this and tailoring the provisions to their business, which is really what this should all be about, if they don't do it properly, I think we're going to see some cases of enforcement. Looking at the international space just for a moment, and I'll just, while I keep speaking, just share a screen. We've been looking at this quite carefully, in fact, mainly for our US clients. But the international landscape is very different, actually. In some countries, the concept of clawback is just unlawful. You can't do it. Poland, for example, what we looked at, and this is a little bit old, this was done in Q3 last year. What we've looked at is almost a comparison across various jurisdictions. And it might be irrelevant because most companies that we tend to deal with and this audience are UK incorporated. in the main, but you will have country leads, sometimes very highly paid across the globe. And there's a question, the focus of the regulation and the governance is all about exec reward and exec directors. And there's a question as to how far down the organisation these provisions should be applied. But if you've got a very highly paid country lead, so Peter, your example of someone in Argentina, these concepts are a bit strange in many countries, that you can give something and have to give it back, sometimes potentially for nothing that you personally have done wrong. And looking at that internationally and having a consistent policy is probably going to be impossible. But it's about knowing where the traps are. And the other issues we are going to see more of is where you're moving people around. So where you have someone located in a jurisdiction where it's perfectly possible to do something, but then they move to another country and something is apparent or becomes apparent after they've left or in their new location. How do you operate these provisions? So it's just thinking about the future and mobile workforce, people working remotely, actually knowing where your people are. Because if your exec director is actually working from France 5 days a week or 3 days a week and you don't know that, you should know that, but we don't always know where our people are anymore. Understanding all of that and the changing way people are working is really going to be, I think, the future, coupled with all the disclosure. This will be shared afterwards, this PDF, I think, Karen.
No, that's super, Danny. Thank you. Well, a huge thank you to our contributors today. Really appreciate your time and effort, both in advance of the session and this afternoon. As I said at the start, if anybody's got any questions that they'd like to ask of the network or our speakers associated to what's being discussed today, then please do drop me a note this afternoon. And for now, I will let you hurry on to lunch or your 1 o'clock meetings, and look forward to seeing a lot of you at our first in-person event next month, where we'll be focusing on industrial strategy, and having the opportunity to all meet each other in person. But for today, thanks very much. Good to see so many of you, and thanks again to our speakers. Bye.